Howdy friends, I'm Joel Empey and welcome to another episode of Joel Empey Talks Mixed Martial Arts, and on today's episode we're going to talk about where Douglas Lima ranks amongst the world's best welterweights after his Bellator Grand Prix victory over Rory McDonald this past Saturday. We're also going to talk about what's next for Demian Maia after his big win over Ben Askren this past Saturday, and we're going to look forward to UFC 244. On paper, one of the best cards of the year. From a promotional standpoint, one of the biggest cards of the year. MSG, always a big card. So we're gonna break down several fights on that card and take a deeper look at what makes Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz both bad motherfuckers. So first things first, the biggest winner from last weekend in the world of mixed martial arts was Douglas Lima. He avenged a loss that he had against Rory McDonald, which now his only Bellator loss that he hasn't avenged is his loss to Ben Askren that I don't think he'll ever get the chance to avenge. Although I would probably favor him at this point against Ben Askren. Lima, to me, is one of the best fighters in the world that people don't consider. You know, Ryan Bader, Pitbull, Patricio Pitbull, and then Douglas Lima, in my opinion, are probably the three best Bellator fighters. And all three of those guys deserve to be, borderline top 15 in the pound for pound power rankings of the sport of mixed martial arts. So where does that rank Lima, his victory over McDonald this past weekend? Where does he rank now amongst the world's contenders of welterweights? Where would you rank him compared to the UFC guys? Now you have to think, a win over McDonald. I mean, McDonald thoroughly dominated Tyron Woodley at one point, right? McDonald might be the best welterweight on earth. So beating McDonald, that might have been literally Lima's opportunity. He might have just proved that he's the best welterweight on earth. Now, a lot of people think that Rory McDonald's on a bit of a downskid in his career. He hasn't looked quite as good as of recent. So a lot of people don't consider Rory to be as good as they once did. So the win over Rory kind of puts Lima in a weird spot where we don't know, is he the best? Is he top 5? Is he top 10? Where does he rank? And for my money, I think he would have a hard time against Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington and maybe even Tyron Woodley, these absolute elite welterweight wrestlers. Those guys might give him a hard time. They might be able to wrestle him and wear him down and win a war of attrition decision where, they essentially avoid the fight. The exact type of thing that people do to beat Masvidal and Diaz, which is what makes Masvidal and Diaz BMFs, is that people, to defeat these guys, Lima would be in the same category. He'd be in that BMF category where in order to beat him, the way to beat him is to avoid fighting him. It's to wrestle him, force more neutral situations when you are in wrestling, avoid submissions, don't really open up and throw your own ground and pound because your primary concern is to control the dominant position so you can win on the judges' scorecards and not get submitted while you're doing so. So Lima's kind of in that category, in my opinion. A Leon Edwards or a Jorge Masvidal, like those fights would be really intriguing to see if Lima could beat these guys in just a straight stand-up war. I would probably favor him against Masvidal. Leon Edwards is about a 50-50 for my money. So that's where I would rank Lima. I would rank him 5th in the world at worst. Having Usman, Colby, Woodley, and Leon Edwards, potentially all 4 of those guys ahead of him, potentially just Usman and Colby, and potentially Lima could beat all of those guys. Unfortunately, there's not really a welterweight matchup that Bellator can put on that's going to prove that Lima's the best in the world. They don't have a guy better than Rory, and they don't have an elite wrestler like another Askren or somebody where Lima can prove his worth and can prove that he can beat that style of fighter. So it's hard to know. We'll probably never get to know, unfortunately. But Lima's at worst, in my opinion, the 5th best in the world. So what would be next for Lima? What would be a good next step for Lima? I personally would like to see him fight Lovato Jr. I know in Bellator, it's sort of the thing now, and Rory did it, immediately go up and challenge for his second belt. Double champs are all the rage, and, it would be nice to watch a guy actually stick around and defend his belt. But I don't really need to see him fight Lorenz Larkin. I don't need to see him. There's no contenders I need to see right now. And if we could insert Lima into that middleweight title picture, if Lima wins, now we're really considering him to be one of the best welterweights on earth. If he could be a double champ, beat, Lovato Jr., who's undefeated middleweight champ. And then obviously there's the Lovato and Mousasi rivalry going on right now. So a lot of people maybe don't want to see Lima because they want to see that second fight between those two, Lovato and Mousasi, take place. I think introducing Lima and creating a potential triangle of contenders and challengers at middleweight, that could actually spice things up. And I think Mousasi and Lovato, I believe that fight, no matter what, will always be there for Bellator to make. There will always be intrigue just for it being a rematch. So I don't think you're necessarily burning that fight by inserting Lima into the mix here. Because, if Lima beats Lovato, then we could do Lima versus Mousasi, which would be amazing. And then, that Lovato-Mousasi fight will always be there, even if it's a non-championship fight in the future. I believe that'll be there. It's better as a championship fight, for sure, but we don't lose it by inserting Lima. I think we just create more intriguing permutations that are possible, more interesting matchups. It creates a more interesting scenario and situation. So that's what I would like to see next for Lima. Douglas Lima, you have to watch this guy fight. He's one of the best in the world, one of the most exciting in the world. He always puts on a show, and I hope that he finally gets his due. Now, looking at what should be next for Demian Maia after his big win over Ben Askren, I think that win or lose at UFC 244 for Stephen Thompson, he should fight Demian Maia next. I think win or lose for Stephen Thompson, the Demian Maia fight makes sense for both those guys next. They're both older on in their careers. They've both already been title contenders, and I'm sure they would both like to be title contenders again. So, if either one of them could beat either one of them, right? Like if Maia beats Wonderboy and Wonderboy has a win over Luque, even if Wonderboy has a loss to Luque here, a win over Wonderboy would propel Maia towards, a top 5, 6, 7 opponent and would get him, only a couple of fights away from a title shot. And Wonderboy would be the same thing. Well, Maia's actually on a streak right now. Even if Wonderboy beats Luque, let's say, Luque is only number 14. Maia's actually, I believe, ranked higher. So if he could beat Maia after that, then it would be then he would be on a really nice streak after coming off of that loss to Pettis. And if he loses 2 in a row and then he could beat Maia, that would be, another way to get off on the right track. So why is this fight so interesting? I mean, I think that you can imagine why it would be interesting. It's two guys who are real specialists. Once again, it's another. I love pitting Maia and Wonderboy for that matter up against other extreme specialists, because you're going to get such a contrast of styles. Maia is going to exclusively want to grapple him, exclusively want to commit to the jiu-jitsu game, whereas Wonderboy is going to exclusively want to kickbox. He's going to exclusively want to stick and move and avoid the grappling at all costs. All right, these guys are maybe two of the best specialists in their respective disciplines in the entire sport, let alone, just their divisions. Wonderboy is one of the top kickboxing specialists, crossover from the sport of kickboxing stars in all of MMA. Him or Izzy would be probably the top two, right? Demian Maia, it's the same thing with him in grappling. There's maybe a Kron Gracie or maybe a Jacare or something like that could compete with him for the best jiu-jitsu guy in MMA. But the point is, these guys are both extreme high-level specialists in their respective arts. So them contending against one another would just be so compelling. And I see this as an ESPN show main event. I think you could do a really interesting countdown show with these two guys, following them in their real lives as martial artists. On the poster, you could have them both in their classic martial arts gis, with their black belts on. You could build this fight on respect and good values and stuff like that. I think it would be an incredible ESPN main event. I think it would, sell well on posters. I think the countdown show would be compelling. These guys are both, a little bit later on in their careers. They're both specialists. It's a perfect time for them to match up against each other. The winner can use this fight as a springboard towards getting back towards title contention. The loser, unfortunately, there's always, half of the sport is losers, half of the sport is winners. It's the nature of the game. So, the loser would be in a bit of a hard place, but that's the fight game in general. I think that's the only fight to make next for Maia, and I think it makes sense win or lose this weekend for Wonder Boy. UFC 244 is really a masterpiece of a card. It's top to bottom from the early prelims, the main prelims, and then the entire main card. Every fight on there is an absolute banger. It's such a great card. It's not like UFC 243 where it's top heavy with just, a great main event and a pretty great co-main event, and then the rest is stuff you don't particularly care about. This is a card where you want to tune in on the early prelims when we have, Jennifer Maia taking on Caitlin Chookagian, likely the winner of that fight. And this is on the early prelims. The winner of that fight is likely going to take on Valentina Shevchenko for the UFC women's flyweight title next. And that's just on the early prelims. And, from there, it just goes on and builds all the way until we have this epic spectacle of a fight in the main event. So I'm just going to break down a few of the fights that I'm looking most forward to. It would take too long to break down every single fight, which is something I would like to do because this card is that good. But I'm just going to break down a couple of my favorites. So on the ESPN prelim portion, we have Edmen Shahbazyan taking on Brad Tavares. Brad Tavares is a guy who's been a mainstay, just a staple of the top 15 in the middleweight division in the UFC for years now. I don't want to call him, a journeyman or a gatekeeper, because those terms are generally have a negative connotation to them. But the fact is that Brad Tavares is a guy who is, between 15 and 10 typically in his career, has never broken into that top 10, but has never really fallen past that 15 mark. So he is a bit of a gatekeeper to where if you can beat Tavares, you're an elite middleweight. There's no doubt about it. Only elite middleweights can beat Tavares. And Edmen Shahbazyan's only 21 years old. He's like the male Macy Barber. He is just full of potential. He is just an incredible fighter, well-rounded, up-and-comer, trains, with Ronda Rousey's old team. He's 10-0 in his career, 9 finishes, 3-0 in the UFC, plus one win on the Contender Series, so 4-0 under the Zuffa banner. Only 21 years old. If he wins this, like I said, Tavares occupies that 15 to 10 gatekeeper position. If Shahbazyan can beat Brad Tavares, and he's only 21 years old, he's going to be in the top 10 at only 21, and potentially this kid is growing leaps and bounds between fights. So I want to see how good he looks, because he looked so good in his last fight. I want to see how good he looks in this one. And man, if he goes out there, and even if he just barely beats Brad Tavares, that'll be impressive. But if he goes out there and puts on a show and stops Brad Tavares, Shahbazyan would only be probably 2 fights out of a title shot. He might be the guy to break John Jones's record for youngest UFC champion. The main event on the ESPN prelims is Corey Anderson taking on Johnny Walker. Now, Johnny Walker has been one of the most, must-watch guys since he's been around in the UFC. Undefeated in his UFC run. I believe his last 3 fights are all performance of the nights, all knockouts. And so he's just incredibly exciting. He's so exciting that the knock on him might be that he needs to calm down and be less exciting overall. He injured his shoulder and hasn't been able to fight for several months now. because he did the worm in his post-fight victory, like as a post-fight victory dance. He did the worm and injured his shoulder. So the knock on Johnny Walker is that he's almost too exciting. He needs to be less wild. He needs to calm down and reserve himself a little bit more. And then the thing about Corey Anderson, the knock on him, the reason why he hasn't gotten a title shot, even though he's been a bit of a squeaky tire lately, he hasn't gotten his title shot because he plays it a little bit too safe. He uses his wrestling predominantly. He wins a lot by decision. I believe he's on a 3-fight win streak, all of them by decisions. So we have a real juxtaposition of the wildest, exciting, crazy, eclectic striker who loves to throw flying knees and wicked elbows and stuff and just likes to wow crowds and keep everybody on their feet. Taking on a guy in Corey Anderson who just likes to blanket people, likes to just pressure, wrestle. His cardio is his biggest weapon. His wrestling and his cardio and his pace are his biggest weapons. So this is just a great, exciting contrast of styles type of a matchup. Perfect prelim main event. This is a fight that could easily be on the main card. This could be like a co-main event or a main event on a regular ESPN card, and we're getting it for free on the prelims before the pay-per-view even begins. That's how stacked this card is. The first fight opening up the main card at UFC 244 is Kevin Lee versus Gregor Gillespie, and this is just an incredible matchup. Gregor Gillespie, if you don't know about him, he is the guy that for probably, I feel like 2 or so years now, everybody's been hyping up as this next great up-and-coming contender, but he just doesn't talk at all. He just goes about his business, does his work, shows up, fights, wins. He's almost like a Khabib style. He's just an insane wrestler, ridiculous pressure. Loves to lock up, get that Dagestani handcuff and do his ground and pound from there. He throws probably more ground and pound than Khabib, I would even say. Khabib is a little more position over damage, and Gillespie is definitely a position over damage guy as well, but he airs a little bit more towards damage than Khabib does. And this fight against Kevin Lee for Gregor Gillespie, for the UFC, who's been slowly building Gillespie until now he's got this is his huge breakthrough opportunity, and they gave him probably like the worst matchup for his opportunity, because Kevin Lee is also a guy who's known for having some of the most dominant and powerful wrestling in the entire game. So Gregor's greatest strength that he has utilized to dominate everybody so far is potentially going to be negated by Kevin Lee's wrestling. I'm not sure if Gillespie, they're both so high level, and to my mind, to my eyes, I've never really seen either of these guys get dominated by a grappler. I don't know. Kevin Lee has always said that he thinks he's a bad matchup for Khabib. He thinks he could dominate Khabib. So Kevin Lee's obviously extremely confident in his grappling. Gregor Gillespie, that's what he does. I don't know if their grappling is going to cancel out and it's going to turn into a striking match, where we've seen Lee strike quite a bit, and not the best striker. He got outstruck significantly by Al Iaquinta, who is a very, very good striker. But we've at least seen Lee strike, and we know he's at least competent. He's at least a decent striker. We haven't really seen Gillespie strike. So just because I haven't seen Gillespie strike, I would favor Lee on the feet, although we literally don't know. So it's going to be interesting to see, is this going to be a grappling match? If it is a grappling match, is it going to be a stalemate as a grappling match? If it's a stalemate, are they just going to strike with each other? If they strike with each other, can Gillespie hang? How good is Gillespie? There's a lot of questions in this one, and on Gillespie's side as an up-and-coming contender. But then on Lee's side, Lee is just a guy, he's got all the skills in the world, the skills of a world champion, but just hasn't been able to make it click. He hasn't been able to make everything click yet. 155 seems like it's too much of a weight cut for him, although he's back at that weight class. But he goes up to 170, but only tries it for one fight and fights an elite contender in Dos Anjos and loses, and it just goes right back to 55. I'm not sure if 55 is the answer, if 70 is the answer, if training at TriStar with Faraz Zahabi, which is what he's been doing now. Like, he's finally got a new head coach since his old head coach passed away a couple of years ago, Robert Follis. So is the head coach the X factor that's going to help him get over the hump? Leah has been at just the precipice of being one of the most elite fighters in the UFC, and he's just consistently at that line. Against Iaquinta, if he wins that, he's like right back at the top. He goes up to welterweight for a single fight, fights RDA. If he wins that, he's right at the top. He's always on this precipice. If he beats Gregor Gillespie here, you better believe he's right at the top of the division all over again. So he's perpetually in this spot to succeed. It seems like the UFC wants him to succeed. He's a guy that they want to market, and for good reason. He's marketable. He's entertaining. He's a good fighter. He's young. He's hungry. But he just can't get over this hump lately. This is his fight to try to do that. And, it's a bad matchup for him, just like it's a bad matchup for Gregor. And that's why it's going to be a great spectacle for us as fans. I already talked about Wonderboy Thompson a little bit earlier when I was talking about what I think should be next for Demian Maia. So let's just break down this fight with Wonderboy and Vicente Luque at UFC 244. Luque is a guy that I've had my eye on since about 2015 when he was on the Ultimate Fighter Black Zillions versus ATT. He's about my age, so at that time he was only 23 years old, and you could tell that he was the most improved guy on that show consistently. I think he was the youngest guy, and he was just always the most improved. He came in as a guy with just raw potential, and ended the show as one of the best guys on the entire program, right? And he's had a steady build in the UFC, a really steady build, and I've been cheering for him this whole time. I believe his only UFC loss is to Leon Edwards. Sorry, he also lost his UFC debut to Michael Graves. So he's only got 2 UFC losses, and I've been pulling for this guy to get a top 10 opponent for a while now. And finally he does, and I hate the matchup. I hate it for Vicente because I think he's really good. I think he's a sneaky good guy who can compete with the upper level of the welterweight division. I'm not sure if he's championship material, but he is upper welterweight material. But Wonderboy is just the trickiest matchup, man. Besides the top wrestlers like Usman or Covington, maybe Woodley, I think that Wonderboy is the worst matchup possible for Vicente. Vicente is a brawler. He's a technical brawler. He's a very technical brawler, but a bit of a brawler nonetheless. And Wonderboy is just, maybe the most elite kickboxer, maybe the most elite just stick and move point fighter. And I don't mean point fighter in a derogatory term, but point fighter in the entire UFC. So when you're fighting him, particularly in just a 3-round bout, Wonderboy can be fast on his toes, on his bike for 2 rounds. No problem sticking and moving at an alarming speed, right? And you're not going to be able to score for those 2 rounds. He's going to be able to take 2 rounds point striking against anybody, basically. I think in a 3-round fight, I got Wonderboy over everybody, basically. Maybe Usman or Covington can force a wrestling match on him for those 2 rounds, but I don't know, man. Besides those top-level wrestlers, I got Wonderboy. Nobody in a striking match, I should say, is going to beat Wonderboy in a 3-round fight. He's going to be able to stick and move too effectively for 2 rounds. After 2-3 rounds, he's going to get tired, and at that point, a technical brawler like Luque, his chances of landing that knockout strike like Anthony Pettis did increase exponentially. So that's why I just don't think this fight's going to go well for Luque, and it's unfortunate because, if they could have given him Robbie Lawler or Santiago Ponzinibbio or RDA, these would have all been really great action fights, and they would have been his chance to, I wish they would have given him one of those guys for his chance to break into the top 10, because those would have been way more exciting action fights. So for as a fan, we would have gotten a better show. And from Vicente Luque's point of view, much, much, much more winnable fights, in my opinion. All three of those fights are winnable fights, in my opinion, for Vicente. And so those would have all been, better, easier step ups. And then he would be, at that top 5 sort of precipice, maybe getting a rematch with a Leon Edwards or something to that nature. If Luque can go out here and land a big knockout strike, maybe Pettis showed that, maybe Wonder Boy isn't as fast as he used to be. Maybe his chin isn't what it used to be. Maybe he's a little bit older now. And maybe his chin is exposable, and Luque can expose that and win this fight by knockout. And maybe if he does, he could call for the BMF belt. He's at the right weight. He's on the right night. It would make a lot of sense opponent-wise and everything. I don't know if he would get that fight or anything, but that might be a smart call-up for Luque if he can win. Ultimately, I'm pulling for Luque. I hope he wins by points, by decision, although I don't see him doing that. I see if he does win, it'll be by knockout. If it goes to decision, I think Wonder Boy wins at least the first 2 rounds. Luque might be able to win that 3rd round, but Wonder Boy, if it goes to decision, I would favor for sure. But my ideal outcome here would be Luque by decision, because I like Wonder Boy so much. I don't want to see him get knocked out again. And Luque I like so much. I want to see him move forward in the division and get the Ponzinibbio matchup, or get the RDA or the Robbie Lawler matchup. One of those big action, exciting, stand-up, brawl type of fights, type of wars. That's the perfect showcase for Vicente Luque. And as a Luque fan, I want him to be showcased. I want other people to get on board with the fandom for Luque. That's my breakdown for that. So in the main event of UFC 244, there's a title on the line. The title, the baddest motherfucker in the game. Now, what makes these guys, Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz, what makes them BMFs? What makes this a super necessary title to put out there? I didn't think that they needed to make an actual belt, although I think that's super cool. And the celebrities that are on board for this fight, it's actually ridiculous. The Rock is going to be presenting the belt to the winner, and I mean, it's just wild, man. It's wild. Both these guys have been outcasts. They've been guys that didn't get promoted by the UFC. They've been fringe guys that had to do everything their own way. They lost many, many times in their careers, both of them. But the great thing about mixed martial arts compared to boxing is we don't judge guys for losses. We judge guys on their effort and on the performances that they put forward and on their attitude. And these guys just put on epic performances and have incredible attitudes. And they're just BMFs, man. Like, let's look at this. Jorge, in his MMA career, he's 34-13. Double-digit losses, but everybody still respects the shit out of him. He started pro when he was 18 years old, and he's only been finished 3 times. He hasn't been finished in over a decade. That's what makes him a bad motherfucker. You know what I mean? Hasn't been finished in over a decade. Only been finished 3 times in his career, so that means he has 10 losses by decision. In his UFC career, he's 11-6. 4 out of 6 of his losses are by split decision. All 6 of his losses are by decision. 4 out of 6 are by split decision. He lost by the narrowest of margins, right? Nate Diaz started pro at 19 years old. He's only been finished twice in his whole fucking career. He started at 19. Are you kidding me? He's been in the UFC for a dozen years. He's been in the UFC for over 12 years. He's had over 24 fights in the UFC, and he's only been finished once in all of those fights, competing against the best in the world for over a dozen years. In over 24 contests, he's only been finished 1 time. I mean, these guys they're just legendary in terms of their toughness. They're legendary in terms of their fight styles. That's what makes them BMFs. any ways that anybody beats these guys generally is by avoiding fighting them. It's by using, somebody will beat a Diaz by using their wrestling to gain a dominant position in the judge's eyes. And at that point, they just hold on. They don't try to open up and throw ground and pound because they're intimidated by, a Diaz or even a Jorge getting a sweep and then getting into an advantageous position themselves and raining down their hellfire of ground and pound. Or they're afraid of advancing their position because they might get submitted by a Diaz brother or a Masvidal on the bottom. So people beat these guys by wrestling them and lay and pray, right? Or wall install. They avoid any big actions. They just get into a position where in the judge's eyes, they're winning the fight, and then they hold on for dear life in those positions. Or somebody just sticks and moves. Think about, I know this is Nick Diaz, but think about Carlos Condit versus Nick Diaz. Or think about any of Jorge's split decision losses against like Lorenz Larkin or Ally Quinta or whatever. It's people just fractionally in judges' eyes can outstrike a Diaz brother or a Jorge if they stay on their bike the whole time and never stand in the pocket to trade. They'll just throw their one shot and be on their bike and moving, so that way a Jorge or a Diaz can never actually get their striking off, because Jorge or in the Diaz's, they just stalk. They come forward relentlessly and they look to implement their game. And if you're willing to just play the game and stay on your bike and you have the cardio to do it and you're just running in circles around them and landing your point shots, you're pitter-pattering and you're okay to win on points by decision, you can beat these guys like that. You can beat these guys by avoiding the fight and just being willing to go to decision and win on points. These guys have the opposite style. Diaz and Jorge, they have the opposite style. They have no interest in winning by points, generally. They're never trying to bank rounds. Their entire game is built around destroying their opponent. It's all built around getting the kill. It's all built around finishing the fight. And that's what makes these guys BMFs. It's that these guys have no interest in winning on points. If they're on the ground, they're hunting for a submission. They're hunting for a reversal so they can land vicious ground and pound. Both these guys prefer to strike, but they prefer to strike in an effort to break their opponent's will, so on the feet, to where their opponent now out of desperation needs to shoot for a takedown. And once they do that, then these guys have the submission game to go for the kill there, right? They try to force you to wrestle so they can kill you somewhere else. They try to kill you on the feet to force you to grapple so they can kill you on the ground. They're looking to finish no matter where they are. Think about how Nate beat Conor the first time, right? Nate was at first, he absorbed the damage, and then Conor got a little tired, and then he inflicted his own damage, and then Conor panic wrestled, tried to shoot, and then Nate slipped in the submission. Boom. And that's how these guys do it. What else makes these guys bad motherfuckers? These guys will march to the beat of their own drum. Both of them. It's not just their fighting styles. It's not just the fact that they've been fighting professionally since they were teenagers. That Jorge was fighting 30-year-old adults as a teenager in backyards of Miami with Kimbo Slice for $50 to buy McDonald's. It's not just all that. It's that they march to the beat of their own drum. They will not be promoted by the UFC, yet they have grown to the point where the UFC, who never does non-title main events on a pay-per-view, is doing a non-title main event on a pay-per-view, with these two guys. Masvidal didn't even fight in 2018 because there weren't interesting matchups for him. He had a rough 2017, losing narrowly to Demian Maia and then to Wonderboy, two of the toughest specialists in the game. He lost to both of them by decisions, and he didn't get blown out in either of those fights. Like I said, the Maia fight was a split decision. So he doesn't fight in 2018 because he's in a place in his career where he feels like he's earned more respect than he's being given, and he can't get a big fight that he deserves in his mind, and he did deserve a big fight, so he just doesn't fight in 2018. Nate Diaz hasn't fought in over 3 years. He hasn't fought since, August of 2016. I mean, he just fought in August of this year, 2019, but he didn't fight for like 3 years because he didn't get the fight that he felt like he deserved. He didn't want to play by the UFC's rules and just take a title fight against, a wrestler who's going to just blah, 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 blah. He's not trying to fight the mainstream fights. He's trying to pick and choose his opponent's interesting fights, Diaz is. So Masvidal takes all of 2018 off, doesn't come back until he gets a really intriguing fight. A fight against Darren Till in London, so in Darren Till's hometown. Darren Till, super highly ranked contender. Nobody else wanted that fight. That's the only reason why Masvidal even got that fight, is because no other high contenders even wanted that fight. And he gets the fight against Till in Till's hometown. The UFC is clearly trying to push Till. Till is the guy they're trying to push. They're trying to make Till's name off of Masvidal's back. What does Masvidal do? He goes out there and knocks Till out. Emphatically. Big knockout. And then after the fact, in the post-fight, in the backstage post-fight, he has this extremely viral moment against Leon Edwards, where he gets in a fight backstage against Leon Edwards, and he has the famous line of the 3-piece and the soda. He starts selling 3-piece and a soda T-shirts. He becomes a bigger star off of the backstage accolades than he does even off of the amazing knockout over a highly ranked contender in their hometown. So, boom, now all of a sudden Masvidal, he's off like a rocket ship out of nowhere. After taking 2018 off, having 2 consecutive losses, he's off like a rocket ship. And then the UFC puts him up against Ben Askren, the guy who's talking more shit than anybody. He's the most famous guy in the welterweight division. The UFC is clearly trying to set up Askren for a title shot. They're giving him all the publicity. Askren's promoting the hell out of it. He's doing everything he can. Askren's doing a phenomenal job promoting it. It's probably the biggest fight on the card on a UFC pay-per-view. On a big international fight week card, Askren versus Masvidal is probably the biggest fight because of Askren. The UFC's trying to build Askren. They're trying to build him off of Masvidal's back after Masvidal has this viral moment and everything. And what does Masvidal do? Knocks Askren out in 5 seconds. Fastest knockout in UFC history. So, Masvidal, the UFC is not trying to promote him, but he is promoting himself off of the UFC trying to promote against him. They're betting against him, and he's betting on himself, and he keeps winning. And you just love to see a guy that bets on themselves. It feels like destiny is on Masvidal's side right now. I'll say that. It feels like Masvidal, everything is aligning for him. Everything's going right for him. And then you look at, Nate. He takes 3 years off. He sees Masvidal doing this exciting shit. And then he sees, Anthony Pettis get a big win, come up to 170, get a big win. He sees that opportunity, and he calls for Pettis. Nate Diaz made this matchup, his matchup against Pettis. He made that outside of the UFC. It was just his manager contacted Pettis' manager. Then they brought the fight to the UFC. The UFC made it. So Nate Diaz handpicked his opponent and had the call out of Jorge 100,000% in his mind. He called out Anthony Pettis to get to Jorge because he knew Pettis is a BMF as well. He'll fight him in a way that's going to be stylistically appealing to the fans and is going to oblige Nate in a type of a fight that he can win, right? So Nate goes out there, gets that win, and then calls for the baddest motherfucker in the game. East Coast gangster versus West Coast gangster. Me versus Masvidal. He just puts that out there. Diaz is just a marketing wizard. He puts that out there. Boom. Now we've got the biggest fight of the year in terms of like a pay-per-view sales and everything like that. I would say that this is probably going to be the best pay-per-view of the year, right? And even last week, Nate Diaz, baddest motherfucker in the game, rats himself out for a USADA thing. The UFC, do you realize the brilliance of that? The UFC contacts them that he's tested slightly elevated on this thing. It was guaranteed a tainted supplement. We're just going to brush it under the rug. It's no big deal. Nate Diaz goes, oh, no, my friend. We're not brushing shit under the rug. I'm going out publicly and outing myself, and you will publicly exonerate me. You're not exonerating me behind the scenes, and then this is going to come out months down the line, and there's going to be some big controversy. You're saying I did nothing wrong, even though you guys had an adverse finding, but you're saying I did nothing wrong, so you're exonerating me. You want me to keep hush-hush about this. I'm not keeping hush-hush about this. You are going to publicly exonerate me, or I'm not fighting in your big main event at MSG that you can't do without me. It was such a BMF move by Nate Diaz to force the UFC to publicly exonerate him. Like, I can't even describe what a BMF move that was, because Nate has all the leverage right now, right? In a week, he's the main event. There's no other title fights on the card. You can't put Gastelum versus Till as the main event at MSG. No offense to that fight. You can't. There's no other main event. It's all Nate Diaz and Jorge. This is the biggest pay-per-view of the year. It's all Nate Diaz and Jorge. MSG, always one of the biggest cards of the year. All Nate Diaz and Jorge. So Nate has all the leverage right now. And he's like, no, you will publicly exonerate me right now, or I'm not fighting for you. And think about it, if Nate just goes, okay, yeah, we'll sweep this under the rug or whatever, and it comes out down the line, then the UFC could use that negatively leverage Nate by getting out ahead of your own bad news about you. By getting out ahead of it, you effectively have exonerated yourself. Like, it was such a BMF move to literally be like, hey man, I'm not getting on a plane tomorrow, and there will be no main event next week if you guys do not publicly exonerate me. So that's what makes this a BMF title fight. That's what makes both these guys BMFs. I'm not going to break down who I think is going to win this fight or lose this fight. Just the backstory of what this fight means and why these guys deserve to be in the position that they're in. And, everything about this fight is just a celebration of what makes mixed martial arts great, in my opinion. So I'm not going to break down who I think wins or loses this fight. I will say, it seems to me that Jorge, it felt like this with Izzy as well. It felt more like this with Izzy than it does with Jorge. But it feels like Jorge has a little bit of destiny on his side right now. I think if Jorge wins, it's a title shot for him. If Nate wins, it's probably Connor. Nate's only going to be in the BMF game. I don't think Nate's going to cross back over to the mainstream title track. I think Jorge will cross back over to the mainstream title track if he wins, because a fight against Covington would be a big money fight. Or, I think Masvidal is interested in the UFC title. I think Nate Diaz is operating all the way outside that title. So it'll be interesting to see. I can't wait for this fight, man. I'm so excited. This whole card is going to be epic. This main event is going to be the most epic. I don't know who's going to win. I don't know whoever wins, who they're going to call out. Everything about this is just so intriguing, so exciting. I can't wait for it. I can't wait for next week's show on here on Joel Empey Talks Mixed Martial Arts to break down, what the future is going to look like after this main event. This is going to be electric, ladies and gentlemen. All right, guys, so that does it for this episode of Joel Empey Talks Mixed Martial Arts. I want to thank you so much for watching the episode. Please like the video. I appreciate that very much. Subscribe to the channel. That's probably the best thing you can do to try to support me. Get your friends to subscribe. It costs nothing. It helps me out a lot. Please subscribe to the channel and follow me at Empey Talks on Twitter. That'll be in the description box below, and there's a little tag right there. And until next time, cheers, friends.